first and foremost, Devin, thank you very much for taking a minute out for the show. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Happy to.
So I want to begin our conversation with living through the heavy, going through the last 3.5 years of the pandemic. How did you get through it and how did it change you?
Well, January, first week of January, second week of January 2020 was an amazing year. We had our biggest year about to happen, had just cobbled together a annual TED style conference with Harvard Medical and Mass General Hospital. And that was an exciting opportunity. And TED Med had just wrapped up. And then I came back from TED Med, which was for the first time in Boston. And we got an email saying, whoops, one of our speakers has COVID. Thankfully, she recovered and there wasn't a long haul effect. But I went into my 2 weeks or whatever it was back then of isolation. And my big aha coming out was, we're getting the hell out of Dodge, So I packed my little family up and we drove cross country to Montana, where my wife's family had a ranch, and thought we'd be there for, a few weeks, maybe a month. Turned out we arrived April 1st, and April Fool's Day taught us we were going to be there a lot longer than we thought. Year and a half when we were done. Year and a half. And in that time, the business absolutely face flopped into the pavement, and I kind of looked up and tried to pick myself up and kind of fell back down, and then reached up again and realized it was time to change the way I did what I did. I had always trained speakers online, but I hadn't really made the connection, Joe, that the successful TEDster is successful. The talk goes viral. I mean, it's right in my face, but I hadn't really given it value, not because of the butts in the seats in the auditorium, but because of the views through the screen. And out of that aha, I saw a need in the Zoom community, newfound Zoom world, to bring a new curriculum and approach to communications to folks outside of TED. And so Screen Leadership, the course, was born.
So talk to me a little bit about exactly what you do on a daily basis. I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of third graders. It's career day. And one of the kids says, hey, what do you do for a living? How do you answer that?
Have you ever heard of TED Talks? And amazingly, even middle schoolers have these days. So they all raise their hands and I'll say, I help TED speakers become the best speakers. And over the last almost 10 years now, we've worked with hundreds of speakers, either in the TED context, TEDx context, or the TED style.
Yeah.
I was the first mover innovator in the online education space for TED style public speaking. Yeah. Won't get me a cup of coffee, but it's one of those fun little nuggets of info.
Yeah. So what did you want to be when you were in the third grade? What was your dream?
Gosh, haven't been asked that, and let me think about it. I was sure I was gonna live the life of Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer. We lived on the St. Johns River in Jacksonville, Florida. And my dream was to get to the island. There's an island just in the middle of the river. And never did, but that was my plan for a long time.
Yeah. So how did you get to this point? Public speaking is one of the biggest fear inducers on the planet. Sure. Tell me where you were, about your childhood and the seeds that actually grew into who you are today.
Good question. I had to kind of rear view that a few years ago and ask myself, how in the world did this happen? I mean, when I say this happened, right out of the chute with my first client group of TEDsters as a speaker trainer, I ended up with 5 speakers that blew the 1 million views out of the door. And one of them became the single most intensely viewed speaker in the history of TED, an all-time top 10 TEDster, and hovers around number 7 or 8 with 46 million views right now. And that was a little bit of a gobstopper surprise. You expect you're going to have some good speakers, but not one of the defining speakers of all time. And so kind of like Moses looking down at his hands with this rod that's been placed there, what is this and for what purpose? Well, as I was sifting and sorting that, I looked back and, is it by accident that my father hired professional adult speaker trainers for me when I was giving my first campaign speech as a senior patrol leader in the Boy Scout troop? Probably not. That type of thing pulsed. I was 16, 15 years old at my first Toastmasters meeting where all the adults gathered, and there I was. So I think in the rearview mirror, it stands to reason. But my career had nothing to do with training speakers. It had a bit to do with conference design.
Yeah.
It had quite a bit to do with marketing and public relations over the years. And it wasn't until the 2008 economic implosion, just face planted me there's twice in the pavement with a nonprofit startup that I was running in Tampa, Florida, that I kind of reoriented and enrolled in seminary of all things, not to become a pastor in the pulpit, but to deconstruct TED Talks.
Yeah.
Understand why these things were these lectures, some would say secular sermons, why these lectures were getting hundreds of thousands, millions of views. And up to that point, only Tony Robbins and Billy Graham were getting views like that.
Yeah.
So, seminary in a way was kind of the doorway,
Yeah.
to understanding there's something different taking place in the TED context. What is it? I was able to deconstruct that and then come up with an answer set that, speaks for itself.
Who's your favorite speaker? Who's somebody that just absolutely goes to your core?
The favorite is the breakaway first guy, Dr. Robert Waldinger. He's a Harvard researcher who looks at health and happiness in the lives of men and families. And he has a talk, they call it the Good Life Talk, that summarizes his research findings that, reach back a longitudinal data set that reaches back to the 1930s. He wasn't the director, he's the fourth director of the study now. But in the 1930s, they started measuring every facet of a man's life: his height, his weight, his temperament type. They interviewed his wife. They used to measure the size of the cranium when they thought that gave you good information. It doesn't. But those findings he wanted to bring to a wider audience than just academics. And one of his board members said, "Bob, you need to give a TED Talk." So Dr. Waldinger dutifully showed up at a TEDx open house and pitched his idea worth spreading. He was one of 120 people that weekend, vying for about 80 slots. And he just skated in. Again, a great presenter, but very academic in its field and symposium, very not TED. But we linked arms and decided to work together. And I'll never forget, he asked me, "When will I meet Ted?" As in technology, entertainment, the design, the acronym. He thought a man named Theodore was convening thought leaders, and worse, he'd never even seen a TED Talk. So we started at the very, very basics together.
Yeah. Interesting. So let me ask you this. In the annals of watching speeches, what would be a historic speech you would have loved to have been in the audience to witness?
JFK's moon speech. When you talk about a story, a data story, a data speech, a technology and science, that is the defining speech. And it's about the length of a TED Talk. Go figure.
Yeah. So what's your favorite TED Talk?
Well, I don't have a favorite, as much as I have a number in different categories, right? One of my heart projects, it never became a breakaway talk. I think maybe 5,000 views to this day, was one that Joe Kearns Goodwin delivered. He's Doris Kearns Goodwin's son, the presidential historian and author. And Joe had come back from Iraq and Afghanistan with an understanding that, service on the part of our youth, he believes, should be a doorway to citizenship. Every young person should give a year and a half of their teen years to our nation in service, whether in the military or in the Peace Corps or city year. It didn't matter, but that obligation we have as Americans should be more than just being born here and paying our taxes, which many don't do. So it was a call for a draft, if you want to put a slant on it.
Yeah.
But it's it was a success in this sense. His mother gets millions of views no matter what she does, and that wasn't Joe's goal. Joe wanted a seat at the public policy table. He wanted to be part of that discussion in the presidential campaign season that brought national service to the fore. And the Clinton campaign invited him to weigh in, and General Stanley McChrystal invited him to be on his board of directors. And the Aspen Institute, arguably a competitor with TED for idea sharing, they profiled his talk. And so that's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
I think of it every Memorial Day and every Veterans Day.
Yeah. So what's been the best advice you've ever gotten?
In terms of public speaking?
Or just in general? Yeah, maybe the Venn diagrams kind of come together.
Hmm. I think of it often. I wish I'd taken it a little bit more seriously. When I was in my teens, early 20s, I had a habit of asking older men if they had one piece of advice to give me, what would it be? If I were their son,
Yeah.
what would that piece of advice be? And some of those were interesting, but the one that stood out was the father of a gal I was dating briefly. He had successful speedboat, business in Jacksonville, Florida area. And but prior to that, I learned he had been a professional gambler before there was like gambling on television, and it was all, back channel, and he was pretty darn successful at it, and his wife made him drop it. And I thought, ooh, this is going to be a good one.
Yeah.
He said, take care of your back and your teeth. Okay. And that was it.
Okay. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great advice. So what is your motivation every day? What gets you out of bed? What gets you to help people be their best and to evolve as yourself?
I think you said, what was the path to this? Part of it was that seminary path, but my major, my degree that I never finished, was a master's in Christian leadership, which you can change the title of to servant leadership, which to this day is the role I play with these thought leaders who introduce world-changing ideas on stage and screen. I say I'm a Sherpa, right?
Yeah.
And that summit is your TED Talk. And so climbing that Mount Everest of public speaking together is my role to get you up there safely and down. Never forget that I'm a servant to your talk, but I'm leading you up a hillside I've been up and down hundreds of times, know where the wind is bad, where to pitch a tent, where the gravel crumbles.
Yeah.
And I'll be there to take the photo of you holding the summit flag.
Yeah.
Well, all of that is in the context of, oh my gosh, pinch myself. I can't believe I'm working with these people. They're brilliant minds at the absolute apex of their game. Every engagement with a client that can go 3 to 6 months or more is a free master's program. Actually, I'm paid, so it's a goofy situation that I'm deep diving into this world of expertise that's way outside of my punching weight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's really what I love.
So let me ask you this. Of all of the clients that you've helped, what's one of the most memorable, best success stories you've been involved with?
Well, so we'll skip past Dr. Waldinger's because that's defined.
Yeah.
That is a given. Another favorite is a non-TED talk.
Yeah.
So there was a little startup pre-pandemic that brought me on to train the CEO in a TED talk. And he was on his Series B, funding round. He was on Series A, and they were running out of money. That's what it was. And when we got closer and closer to that deadline where they were going to shut off the lights, this little company had one last chance. And that last chance was he was flying to California from Boston. He had the deck we'd been working on with the sticky story pitch that was in the TED style. He had said, screw the TED Talk. We just need to get this pitch right. Can you help. And so he had the deck, and the other document he had on the flight was his resume, because literally they were shutting off the lights. And he came back with 200 million in Series B funding. Said it was the sticky story that he shared, that was shared and reshared and reshared. The retellability factor was there, and he's been generous in saying, I had a hand on the oar of his rowing boat. When I say rowing boat, the little company is a startup called Hydro, which is the Peloton of rowing. And every Christmas you'll see some ads for it. So it was really gratifying, because that was in the pandemic season that I worked with him. And it was really gratifying to see how powerfully the communication tools that are TED translated in a non-TED environment for a CEO of a startup, later for a CEO delivering an all hands to the employees, later for an engineer delivering a message at a conference for National Association of Entrepreneurial Engineering Professors, so that's been really gratifying.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Let's say you run into that 15-year-old version of you at the Toastmasters. You can give that young version of you a piece of advice based on the wisdom you've gained in your life so far. What advice would you impart on that young version of you?
Well, there's an easy answer and a hard answer. Let me give you the easy one first.
Okay.
Take care of your back and your teeth.
There you go.
Secondly, don't take for granted the people that are putting your path. When I was younger, I did. I took for granted some of the really power brokers that relationships introduced me to, and I always thought I was going to be sitting down with those people in whatever context. And sure, relationships and introductions continue to this day, but I squandered a lot of really potent potential relationships and conversations. So, hubris of youth.
Yeah, absolutely. So of all the things that you've done and overcome and become the successes, what are you the proudest of?
Marrying my college sweetheart, and managing to do that soon enough that we could have one child who is healthy and is a blessing to this day, and 12 years old. Tied to that is, and it's hardly, I was literally reading a book earlier this morning, thinking of my daughter and the potential of, someday her working in the business. And, but I've made it a conscious effort to let her find her way, if she ever does, to my space. 5th grade, they were taking a public speaking course through the, what's the Young Farmers Organization of America?
FFA?
Yeah. They were learning public speaking. And that was thrilling to see. She got a little award for it. And the book I was reading today was How to Give a TED Talk for Teenagers, written by the head of TED, little known book. And I was reading that thinking, oh, she's going to be 13 in July. I need to get her a copy, and we'll go through it together maybe. But I'll let her guide that.
You know what's interesting? I have one son, and I always find that the apple doesn't fall too far. There's a nature, there's a nurture, there's something that's out of your control. So those things that I didn't directly push have become who he is. It's really weird how life works.
That's neat. How old is your boy?
He's 19. He's on the spectrum. And, I grew up being a sports fan. So I was used to one of my favorite things when I was a kid, we used to write letters to all the baseball players. Sorta, all these guys, we'd call them at the hotel. And this was in the 80s. They'd patch us through. I got Jose Canseco on the phone one time, all groggy. It's like, hey, Jose, will you sign a card if I mail it to you? He was like, sure, kid, and hung up.
That is remarkable.
That won't happen anymore. But anyway, he loves meeting players and getting involved. And I never really foisted any of that. Just kind of happened. So when I think about the path that can happen, sometimes it just kind of magically falls out of the cosmos and you just go with it,
We want to, I think we share in that we want our kids to be, to flourish, right? In their own context, in their own direction. and be surrounded by good people.
Yeah.
So, my prayer for you and your son, my prayer for me and little Hutch is just that.
Yeah, right on. So, Devin, at the end of the day, everyone has this perception view, family, friends, clients, colleagues, but you run the show. What is your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Hmm. I'm 54 years old, and I think it took a while to really accept what had happened and what was happening at a level that I was comfortable with it, right? Um, uh, I think servant leader is that title, is that role. And for a long time, I doubted the leader part, but over time, became a lot more comfortable with it.
So, if anyone wants to hire you, learn more about you, reach out to you, anything about your world, where do they go?
Well, I'll tell you, I'd be happy to give a URL that actually will have a learning tool that'll tell a little bit of the story of how a successful TED Talk was pulled together. If they go to Connect to Compel, and that's TO, Connect, TO, Compel, now.com, there's a free resource that tells a little bit about Dr. Waldinger's story and also the three kind of critical tools that TED um, innovated with, customized, and now apply outside of the TED context for podcast interviews, for keynotes, for pitches, and of course, the TED stage.
Right on. Devin, thank you so much for your story. Thank you for your time. Best of luck with everything.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for some really thought-provoking questions. It's
My pleasure.
been a joy.
Absolutely.